Her kiss meant the end of a dynasty. Alessandra Romano had always known she was nothing more than a transaction. When her family's empire crumbled, she was delivered to Dario Benedetti, a man known for taking what he wanted. He traced a slow circle on the inside of her wrist, his smirk dark. "Your father made a mistake," he murmured. "Now I decide what happens to you." Chapter 1. The Dead of Silence. The rain lashed against the stained glass windows of the cathedral, each drop a staccato note in a symphony of sorrow. Alessandra Romano knelt, her black lace veil obscuring the world, but not the grief that clawed at her throat. Her father's casket, a monstrous mahogany beast, lay before the altar, a stark reminder of the empire that had crumbled, leaving her adrift in a sea of sharks. She wasn't mourning the man, she was mourning the life she'd lost, the naive belief that her world was impenetrable. Her fingers, usually adorned with delicate rings, were bare, the cold marble floor seeping into her bones. The scent of incense, usually a comfort, was now suffocating, mingling with the metallic tang of fear that coated her tongue. She'd always known her life was a performance, a delicate dance on a tightrope strung between rival families, but she'd never imagined the rope would snap so violently. The priest's voice droned on, his words about eternal rest a hollow mockery. Rest? There would be no rest for her. Not now. Not ever. Her father, Antonio Romano, had gambled away their legacy, their security, their very lives, on a desperate bid to reclaim lost territory. He'd lost. And the price of his failure was her. A hand, heavy and possessive, landed on her shoulder. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Marco, her father's consigliere, his face a mask of stoic duty, his eyes betraying a flicker of pity. He'd been the one to deliver the news, his voice devoid of its usual warmth, the words cold and sharp as shattered glass. "Alessandra," he'd said, his hand gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles were white. "Your father, he made arrangements. Before he died." She'd stared at him, her mind refusing to grasp the implication. Arrangements? What arrangements could possibly salvage this wreckage? "The Benedettis," Marco continued, the name a curse in the hushed room. "They've agreed to honor your father's debt. In exchange for you." The world had tilted on its axis. The Benedettis. Their family's sworn enemies. The very name conjured images of darkness, of ruthless power, of a world she'd been carefully shielded from. And now, she was to be handed over to them, a sacrificial lamb to appease their wrath. Marco's hand tightened on her shoulder, a silent command. She rose, her legs stiff and uncooperative, the black dress feeling like a shroud. The cathedral was filled with faces, a blur of black suits and veiled hats, their eyes curious, judgmental, some even gleeful. They were vultures, circling the remains of her family's pride. As she walked down the aisle, the heavy oak doors of the cathedral creaked open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the storm-ravaged sky. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his presence radiating an aura of controlled power that made the air crackle with tension. Dario Benedetti, the man who now held her fate in his hands. He didn't approach. He simply stood there, a statue carved from shadows, his eyes, even from this distance, burning with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 30s, his face a study in sharp angles and hard lines, framed by dark, unruly hair. There was a cruel beauty to him, a dangerous allure that both terrified and intrigued her. The wind whipped around him, carrying the scent of rain and something else, something darker, something untamed. It was the scent of power, of dominance, of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Marco led her towards him, each step an agonizing descent into the unknown. The faces in the crowd seemed to fade, the sounds of the storm growing louder, drowning out the whispers and murmurs. All that remained was Dario Benedetti, his gaze fixed on her, unwavering, unyielding. As she reached him, he extended a hand, not in greeting, but in possession. His fingers were long and elegant, the skin surprisingly smooth, a stark contrast to the rough texture of his tailored suit. He didn't speak, his silence more intimidating than any threat. She placed her hand in his, the contact sending a jolt of electricity through her veins. His grip was firm, not painful, but undeniably possessive. He traced a slow circle on the inside of her wrist with his thumb, his touch sending shivers down her spine. It was a deliberate act, a subtle assertion of his control. His dark eyes, flecked with gold, held a hint of amusement, a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear, the scent of expensive cologne, and something subtly musky, almost animalistic, filling her senses. "Your father made a mistake," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through her very core. "Now I decide what happens to you." The words were not a question, they were a statement of fact, a declaration of ownership. And in that moment, standing in the rain-soaked entrance of the cathedral, surrounded by the ghosts of her past and the looming shadow of her future, Alessandra Romano knew that her life, as she had known it, was over. She was no longer Alessandra Romano, daughter of a fallen capo. She was a possession, a prize, a pawn in a game far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. The silence that followed was heavier than any chains, a binding vow made not in love, but in debt and despair. The storm raged on, mirroring the tempest brewing within her, a silent scream trapped in the gilded cage of her new reality. She wondered if she would ever find her voice again, or if it was lost forever, swallowed by the encroaching darkness of the Benedetti world. A world where her only value would be measured by how well she played her part, and her only hope might not be the escape, but surviving its master. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Benedetti Estate. The drive to the Benedetti Estate was a blur of rain-streaked windows and winding roads. Alessandra sat stiffly in the back of the black limousine, Dario Benedetti a silent, imposing presence beside her. He hadn't spoken a word since they left the cathedral, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his profile etched against the gray light like a carving on an ancient coin. The silence was a thick, suffocating blanket, punctuated only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the low hum of the engine. She stole glances at him, trying to decipher the enigma that was her captor. His hands, resting on his thighs, were strong and capable, the nails neatly trimmed, a single, heavy gold ring adorning his left ring finger, a serpent coiled around a ruby, the Benedetti family crest. It was a subtle reminder of the power he wielded, the legacy he carried. The car finally pulled through a pair of imposing wrought iron gates, the Benedetti crest prominently displayed, the serpent's eyes seeming to glint in the fading light. The estate was a sprawling complex of stone buildings, surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens that, even in the gloom of the storm, held a hint of their former glory. It was a fortress, a world unto itself, a place where the rules of the outside world held no sway. As they approached the main house, a massive villa that loomed like a Gothic castle, Alessandra felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This was it. There was no turning back. She was entering a world of shadows, of secrets, of unspoken rules and ancient vendettas. The car stopped in front of a grand entrance, a massive oak door flanked by two stone lions, their faces weathered by time and the elements. A uniformed servant hurried out, umbrella in hand, opening the door for Dario. He stepped out, his movements fluid and graceful, and then turned, extending a hand towards Alessandra. She hesitated, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Taking his hand felt like crossing a threshold, a point of no return. But she had no choice. She placed her hand in his, the familiar jolt of electricity sending a shiver down her spine. His grip was firm, reassuring in a way that surprised her. He led her towards the entrance, his silence still unbroken. The interior of the villa was even more opulent than she had imagined. The entrance hall was a vast expanse of marble floors, soaring ceilings, and intricate frescoes depicting scenes of ancient battles and mythical creatures. The air was heavy with the scent of old money, of beeswax and wood smoke, and something else of faint, almost imperceptible hint of something metallic, like the lingering scent of blood. An older woman, her face lined with a mixture of severity and curiosity, stood waiting for them. She was dressed in a simple black dress, a silver crucifix hanging around her neck. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes, sharp and intelligent, assessing Alessandra with a critical gaze. "Don Dario," she said, her voice surprisingly soft, a hint of a Venetian accent coloring her words. "Welcome home. And this is Signorina Romano?" Dario nodded, his expression unreadable. "This is Alessandra. She will be staying with us indefinitely." The woman's eyes flickered over Alessandra, a silent appraisal that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "I am Sophia," she said, her voice losing some of its softness. "I am the housekeeper. I have been with the Benedetti family for many years. I know the ways of this house. You will do well to listen to me." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Alessandra nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Sophia gestured towards a grand staircase that curved upwards into the shadows. "Your room is on the second floor, Signorina. I have had it prepared for you. Dinner will be served in 1 hour. In the small dining room. Don Dario will join you." Alessandra followed Sophia up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. The corridors were lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, their eyes seeming to follow her, judging her, reminding her that she was an outsider, an intruder in this ancient and unforgiving world. Her room was large and lavishly decorated, with a 4-poster bed draped in heavy silk curtains, a fireplace with a crackling fire, and a balcony overlooking the gardens. It was beautiful, but it felt cold, impersonal, like a gilded cage. A prison cell dressed in finery. Sophia pointed to a wardrobe filled with clothes. "These were selected for you. I hope they will be to your liking." Alessandra glanced at the clothes, a collection of elegant dresses, silk scarves, and delicate lingerie. They were clearly expensive, chosen with a discerning eye, but they weren't her style. They were clothes meant to adorn, to display, to make her a more appealing possession. "Thank you, Sophia," she managed to say, her voice a mere whisper. Sophia nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Rest, Signorina. You have had a long day. And try to eat something. Don Dario, he appreciates a woman with an appetite." With that, she left, closing the door behind her with a soft click that echoed in the silence. Alessandra sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. She looked around the room, at the opulent furnishings, at the clothes that weren't hers, at the fire that offered warmth but no comfort. She was alone, utterly alone, in a world she didn't understand, at the mercy of a man she barely knew. A man who held her life in his hands. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, pressing in on her, whispering secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crackling fire and the beating of her own fearful heart. Tonight, she would dine with the devil, and she had no idea what the price of that meal would be. The only certainty was, her life, as it once was, felt further away than ever before. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Palazzo. The small dining room, despite its name, was still a grand affair. A long mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, dominated the room, set with delicate china, gleaming silverware, and crystal glasses that shimmered in the candlelight. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, which were adorned with tapestries depicting hunting scenes, a stark reminder of the predator-prey dynamic that now defined Alessandra's existence. She had changed into one of the dresses Sophia had provided, a deep emerald green silk that clung to her curves and accentuated the paleness of her skin. It was a beautiful dress, but it felt like a costume, a disguise she was forced to wear. She felt exposed, vulnerable, her every move scrutinized, judged. Dario was already seated at the head of the table when she entered, his presence filling the room, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that made her heart flutter nervously. He had changed as well, into a dark velvet smoking jacket that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean physique. He looked regal, almost dangerously handsome, the flickering candlelight highlighting the sharp angles of his face, the hint of a smile playing on his lips. He rose as she approached, a gesture of courtesy that surprised her. "Alessandra," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "You look stunning." The compliment, though unexpected, felt calculated, a move in a game she didn't understand. She forced a smile, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Thank you, Don Dario." He gestured towards the chair opposite him. "Please sit." She sat, her movements stiff and awkward, acutely aware of his gaze on her. A silent servant, a young man with downcast eyes and a nervous demeanor, appeared, placing a plate of antipasti before her, a colorful array of cured meats, olives, and marinated vegetables. Dario poured her a glass of wine, a deep ruby red that matched the serpent's eye on his ring. "Chianti Classico," he said. "From our own vineyards." She took a sip, the wine rich and full-bodied, a welcome warmth spreading through her. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the aroma of the food filled her senses. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clinking of silverware against china and the crackling of the fire. Alessandra picked at her food, her appetite diminished by the tension that hung heavy in the air. Dario, however, seemed to enjoy his meal, eating with a slow, deliberate grace that was both mesmerizing and unnerving. He watched her, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. Finally, he broke the silence. "Tell me, Alessandra," he said, his voice soft, almost conversational. "What do you know about the Benedetti family?" She hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She knew the basics, of course, the centuries-old rivalry with her own family, the whispers of ruthless dealings, the reputation for unwavering loyalty and brutal retribution. But she also knew that saying the wrong thing could have dire consequences. "I know that you are a powerful family," she said carefully, "that you have a long history." He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "A long and complicated history. A history intertwined with that of your own family. A history written in blood." She shivered, the word blood hanging in the air like a threat. She looked down at her plate, unable to meet his gaze. "Your father," he continued, his voice losing its conversational tone, becoming sharper, harder. "He was a foolish man. He made a mistake that cost him everything. And now you are here to pay his debt." She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was no pity in his gaze, only a cold, hard calculation. "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you?" he asked, his eyebrows raised slightly. "Do you understand the implications? The responsibilities? The sacrifices?" She swallowed, her throat dry. I am trying to." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her, judging her. "You are a beautiful woman, Alessandra. Intelligent. Strong-willed. I can see that. But you are also naive. You have been sheltered. Protected. You have no idea what the real world is like. The world, my world." He paused, letting his words sink in. "In my world, loyalty is everything. Family is everything. And betrayal is punished swiftly and severely." She felt a chill run down her spine. She knew he was talking about her father, about his betrayal of some unspoken code, some agreement between their families. But she also knew that he was warning her, reminding her of her precarious position. I am loyal," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "To my family." He smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. "Your family is gone, Alessandra. Shattered. Destroyed. Your loyalty now belongs to me. To the Benedetti family." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And I expect absolute obedience." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Alessandra felt a surge of defiance, a spark of the fire that had once burned brightly within her. But she knew she couldn't show it. Not yet. She had to be smart. She had to be patient. She had to learn the rules of this game, the unspoken language of this world, if she wanted to survive. The whispers of the palazzo seemed to coil around them, ancient secrets and shadowed promises filling the room, solidifying her place in this new, dangerous world. The servant cleared their plates, a silent ghost in their tense standoff, leaving her wondering what the next course would bring, and if she could stomach it. Chapter 4. The Gilded Cage Opens. The days that followed settled into a strange, unsettling routine. Alessandra was confined to the Benedetti estate, a gilded cage where every comfort was provided, but every freedom was denied. She spent her mornings exploring the vast gardens, the carefully manicured lawns and vibrant flower beds, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed beauty of the surrounding countryside. She walked along the stone pathways, her footsteps echoing in the silence, her only companions the birds and the occasional glimpse of a gardener, who would bow his head and avert his eyes as she passed. She was given free rein of the villa's library, a vast, cavernous room filled with leather-bound books, ancient manuscripts, and the scent of aged paper and beeswax. She spent hours there, losing herself in the pages of forgotten tales, seeking solace in the stories of others, trying to escape the reality of her own. But even in the library, she was never truly alone. Sophia, the ever-present housekeeper, seemed to materialize out of nowhere, her silent presence a constant reminder that she was being watched, monitored, assessed. Sophia was a fount of information about the Benedetti family, a walking encyclopedia of their history, their traditions, their secrets. She spoke of them with a mixture of reverence and fear, her words painting a picture of a family steeped in power, tradition, and a code of honor that was both rigid and unforgiving. The Benedettis have ruled this region for centuries, Sophia told her one afternoon, as they sat in the library, Alessandra pretending to read, Sophia dusting the shelves with a meticulous precision. They have always been respected, feared. They are not a family to be crossed. Alessandra nodded, her gaze fixed on the page, but her mind racing. She was trying to piece together the puzzle of her situation, to understand the dynamics of this family, the unspoken rules that govern their lives. Don Dario, Sophia continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, he is different. He is more ruthless than his father. More ambitious. He has plans. Alessandra looked up, her curiosity piqued. Plans? Sophia hesitated, her eyes darting towards the door, as if afraid of being overheard. He wants to expand. To reclaim what was lost. To make the Benedetti family stronger than ever before. Alessandra realized that Sophia was talking about the territories her father had lost, the lands that had once belonged to the Romanos, the lands that were now the object of Dario's ambition. And what about me? Alessandra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Where do I fit in? Sophia looked at her, her expression a mixture of pity and something else, something that looked like warning. You are a pawn, signorina. A valuable piece in his game. He will use you to achieve his goals. The words sent a chill down Alessandra's spine. She had known, of course, that she was a means to an end, a tool in Dario's hands. But hearing it spoken aloud, by someone who knew this family so intimately, made it all the more real, all the more terrifying. The evenings were the most difficult. Dinner with Dario was a nightly ritual, a performance she had to endure. He was always courteous, always attentive, but there was a coldness in his eyes, a distance that made her feel like an object, not a person. He would ask her questions about her life, about her family, about her interests, but his questions felt like interrogations, his gaze probing, searching for weaknesses, for vulnerabilities. He was studying her, learning her, trying to understand what made her tick. One evening, as they sat in the small dining room, the candlelight flickering on their faces, he asked her about her mother. Your mother, he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. She died when you were young, yes? Alessandra nodded, her throat tightening. She rarely spoke about her mother. The memories too painful, too precious to share with this man. What was she like? He asked, his gaze fixed on her, his eyes surprisingly compassionate. Alessandra hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She remembered her mother as a warm, loving presence, a woman of grace and beauty, a woman who had tried to shield her from the harsh realities of their world. She was kind, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Gentle. She loved flowers. And music. Dario nodded, his expression unreadable. She sounds like a woman who deserved a better life. The words surprised her. She hadn't expected him to show any empathy, any understanding. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, his grip firm, sending a familiar jolt of electricity through her veins. I know this is not the life you wanted, Alessandra, he said, his voice low, his gaze intense. But I will try to make it bearable. I will protect you. The words, intended for comfort, brought a new fear. His protection was a gilded cage, just another form of control. But tonight, there was something beyond protection. There was a glimpse of a man behind the capo, a person capable of understanding. It confused, it intrigued, and most of all, it terrified her. She was walking a tightrope, and the slightest wind of emotion, the slightest wrong word, could send her spiraling down. The opened cage still had bars, but the outside view, for the first time, seemed a little bit less daunting. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise that resonated louder than any words could, and, against her better judgment, she felt a flicker of hope. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Forgotten Life. One crisp morning, after a week of strange dinners and silent observations, Dario surprised Alessandra. He found her in the library, nestled in a window seat, a book of poetry open in her lap, though her gaze was lost in the distant, rolling hills beyond the estate. Alessandra, he said, his voice softer than usual, a hint of something akin to invitation in his tone.
Get dressed.
We're going out. She looked up, startled.
Out? Where?
He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his features, making him appear almost boyish. It's a surprise. But trust me, you'll enjoy it. Trust. A loaded word in their precarious situation. She hesitated, her mind filled with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. It was the first time he'd offered anything beyond the confines of the estate, the first crack in the carefully constructed walls of her captivity. She chose a simple, cream-colored dress, less formal than the gowns Sophia usually selected for her, a small act of rebellion, a silent assertion of her own taste. She brushed her hair, letting it fall loosely around her shoulders, a departure from the severe updos she'd been wearing. Dario was waiting for her in the entrance hall, dressed in a casual, but impeccably tailored, suit. He looked less intimidating, more approachable. He offered her his arm, a gesture of gentlemanly courtesy that felt strangely natural. They drove in silence for a while, the limousine gliding through the countryside, the landscape a tapestry of rolling hills, vineyards, and ancient olive groves. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, a welcome change from the heavy, perfumed air of the villa. Finally, they arrived at a small, picturesque village nestled in a valley, a cluster of terracotta-roofed houses clinging to a hillside. It was a scene straight out of a postcard, a world away from the opulent, but suffocating, world of the Benedetti estate. This is beautiful, Alessandra said, her voice filled with genuine awe. Dario smiled, pleased by her reaction.
This is San Giorgio, he said.
It's a special place.
For me.
He led her through the narrow, cobblestone streets, the villagers greeting him with a mixture of respect and affection. They called him Don Dario, their voices filled with a warmth that surprised Alessandra. She had seen him as a ruthless capo, a man to be feared, but here, in this small village, he seemed different, more human. They stopped at a small, family-run trattoria, the aroma of freshly baked bread and simmering tomato sauce wafting out into the street. Dario was greeted like an old friend by the owner, a stout, jovial man with a booming laugh and a twinkle in his eye.
Dario, mio amico,
he exclaimed, embracing Dario warmly. It's been too long. And who is this beautiful signorina? Dario introduced Alessandra, his hand resting lightly on her back, a gesture of possessiveness that sent a shiver down her spine, but this time It wasn't entirely unpleasant. They were seated at a table on a small terrace overlooking the valley, the view breathtaking. The owner brought them a feast of local specialties, handmade pasta, grilled fish, fresh vegetables, and a bottle of local wine. For the first time since her father's funeral, Alessandra felt relaxed. She laughed, she ate, she drank, she engaged in conversation with Dario and the owner, their words a melodic blend of Italian and English. She felt almost normal. Dario watched her, his gaze filled with a warmth that she hadn't seen before. He seemed genuinely happy to see her enjoying herself. "You know," he said, his voice soft, his eyes meeting hers. "You remind me of my mother." Alessandra looked at him, surprised. He had rarely spoken about his family, his past shrouded in mystery. "Your mother?" she asked. He nodded. "She loved this village. She used to bring me here when I was a child. She said it was a place where the soul could breathe." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the distant hills, his expression softening. "She was a good woman. Kind. Gentle. She didn't deserve what happened to her." Alessandra sensed a deep, underlying pain in his voice, a hint of the darkness that lurked beneath his carefully constructed facade. She knew, without him saying it, that his mother's death had been a pivotal moment in his life, a turning point that had shaped him into the man he was today. This was one of the echoes of a forgotten life. She realized hers, and his. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice tight. "But some wounds never fully heal." For the first glimpse, the iron will and hardened exterior seemed to slip, exposing the vulnerability underneath. He quickly changed subject, and they finished their meals. As they walked back to the car, the sun setting behind the hills, casting a golden glow over the village, Alessandra felt a shift in her perception of Dario. He was still a captor, a man who held her fate in his hands. But she had seen a glimpse of something else, a hint of humanity, a flicker of vulnerability. She had seen the echoes of a forgotten life, a life before the darkness, a life before the Benedetti legacy had claimed him. And in that moment, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was a connection. A shared understanding of loss, of pain, of the burdens of a life lived in the shadows. A connection she did not expect, and one that she did not know what to do with. It complicated things, and made the simple act of surviving more difficult. The air was filled with an unspoken question, a silent acknowledgement of a shared humanity that transcended their roles of captor and captive. Chapter 6. The Serpent's First Charm. The return to the Benedetti estate felt different after their day in San Giorgio. The imposing villa, with its shadowed corridors and silent portraits, still held an air of menace, but the shared experience, the glimpse of vulnerability Dario had allowed her, had subtly shifted the balance of power. Or so Alessandra hoped. That evening, Dario didn't summon her to the formal dining room. Instead, Sofia informed her that Don Dario requested her presence in his private study. This was new, a departure from their established routine, and Alessandra felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. The study, she knew, was his sanctuary, his inner sanctum, a place where he conducted his business, made his plans, ruled his empire. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple, but elegant, dark blue dress. She left her hair down, a small act of defiance, a subtle reminder that she wasn't entirely his to control. As she walked towards the study, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor, she rehearsed what she might say, how she might act. She needed to be cautious, to tread carefully, but she also needed to show him that she wasn't a broken bird, a mere possession. The study was as imposing as she'd imagined. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, the air thick with the scent of old paper, cigar smoke, and a hint of sandalwood. Dario's personal scent, she realized. A large, mahogany desk dominated the room, cluttered with papers, a crystal decanter of amber liquid, and a single, heavy object that looked like a paperweight, a silver serpent coiled around a dark, polished stone. The Benedetti crest, again. Dario was standing by the window, his back to the room, gazing out at the darkening gardens. He was dressed in a dark suit, his posture radiating power, but also a hint of weariness. "Alessandra," he said, without turning around, his voice a low rumble.
Come in.
She entered the room, her heart pounding against her ribs. She stood silently, waiting for him to acknowledge her presence. He finally turned, his eyes, dark and intense, sweeping over her. He seemed different tonight. Less guarded, more approachable. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I wanted to talk to you about something important." He gestured towards a pair of leather armchairs facing the fireplace, where a fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Please sit." She sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, acutely aware of his gaze on her. He sat opposite her, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped in front of him. "I know this has been difficult for you," he said, his voice low, his eyes searching hers. "Being here, being my guest." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "I know you miss your old life," he continued. "Your family, your friends, your freedom." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I want you to understand something. I didn't do this lightly. Your father, he left me no choice. He betrayed me. He broke a sacred oath. And there are consequences." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. She knew he was telling the truth, at least in part. She had heard the whispers, the rumors, about her father's dealings, about his desperate attempts to reclaim lost power. "But," he continued, his voice softening, "that doesn't mean I want to hurt you. You are innocent. You don't deserve to suffer for his mistakes." He reached out, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, his grip firm, sending a familiar jolt of electricity through her veins. But this time, there was something else in his touch, a tenderness, a gentleness that surprised her. "I want to offer you something," he said, his voice low, his gaze intense.
À proposition.
She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his.
À proposition?
He nodded. "I want you to work with me,
To help me.
to be my confidant." She opened her eyes, startled and confused. He saw the surprise on her face. "I know it's unexpected," he said, "but I need someone I can trust. Someone who understands the nuances, the complexities. Someone who sees things differently." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "I saw something in you, Alessandra. In San Giorgio. A strength, a resilience,
A spark.
something that reminds me of myself." It was the closest to a compliment he'd ever given her, wrapped in a job offer. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know you can be valuable, you're smart, you're resourceful, and I can offer you things other than this gilded cage. Help me rebuild what our families destroyed." The serpent on his desk seemed to gleam in the firelight, a silent witness to this unexpected offer, this twisted form of courtship. It was a charm, a subtle manipulation, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to gain some control over her life, to carve out a place for herself in this dangerous world. But it was also a dangerous game, a dance with the devil, a pact with the serpent. She was being offered a role, not freedom, but a role might be the first step towards something more. The question was, could she play the game without losing herself entirely? She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of a trap. But all she saw was a challenge and perhaps a glimmer of hope. The choice, as always, was presented as if she had won. Chapter 7. Masks and Midnight Confessions. Alessandra's acceptance of Dario's proposition was a silent one, a nod of the head, a meeting of eyes that held a mixture of apprehension and determination. The following days were a whirlwind of activity, a crash course in the intricate workings of the Benedetti Empire. Dario, surprisingly, was a patient teacher, explaining the complex web of businesses, alliances, and rivalries that made up his world. He started with the legitimate businesses, the vineyards, the olive oil production, the real estate holdings, showing her the books, explaining the finances, introducing her to the key people who ran these operations. He then moved on to the less legitimate side, the protection rackets, the gambling operations, the smuggling networks, revealing these with a matter-of-factness that both shocked and intrigued her. He never forced her to participate in anything that made her uncomfortable, but he also didn't shy away from the realities of his world. He wanted her to understand, to see the full picture, the good, the bad, and the ugly. She learned quickly, her sharp mind absorbing the information like a sponge. She asked questions, she challenged assumptions, she offered suggestions, her insights surprisingly astute, her perspective often offering a fresh angle on old problems. She discovered a talent for strategy, for negotiation, for seeing the hidden connections, the unspoken motivations that drove the people around her. Dario, in turn, seemed to appreciate her contributions, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to respect, even admiration. He started to rely on her, to seek her counsel, to include her in his decision-making process. He treated her, not as a possession, but as a partner. Almost. But there were still walls between them, masks they both wore. Dario, despite his moments of openness, remained an enigma, his past shrouded in secrecy, his true motivations hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed control. Alessandra, despite her growing confidence, remained wary, her heart guarded, her trust tentative. One evening, after a long day spent poring over financial records, Dario invited Alessandra to join him for a drink on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The air was warm, the sky a canvas of stars, the scent of night-blooming jasmine filling the air. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their wine, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of the city. "You're good at this," Dario said, his voice soft, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Better than I expected." Alessandra smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'm learning," she said. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "You're more than just learning, Alessandra. You're thriving. You have a gift. For this." She looked down at her hands, uncomfortable with his praise. "It's a strange world," she said. "Not the world I was raised in." He nodded. "No. It's not. But it's the world we live in. And we have to make the best of it." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the horizon, his expression clouding over. "Sometimes I wish things were different," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That I could escape. Start over. Be someone else." Alessandra looked at him, surprised by his confession. It was the most vulnerable she'd ever seen him, the mask slipping, revealing the man beneath the capo. "What would you be?" she asked, her voice soft, curious. "If you weren't Don Dario?" He smiled, a sad, wistful smile. "A farmer, perhaps," he said. "Working the land. Living a simple life. Away from all this darkness." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored her own. "And you, Alessandra? What would you be? If you weren't here?" She thought for a moment, her mind drifting back to her old life, to the dreams she'd had before her world had shattered. "A teacher," she said. "I always loved children. And books. I wanted to share my love of learning with others." He nodded, his gaze understanding. "A noble profession," he said. "A fulfilling life." He reached out, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, his grip gentle, sending a familiar shiver down her spine. But this time it felt different. It felt comforting. "Maybe someday," he said, his voice low, his gaze intense. "We can both find those lives. After all the noise. Maybe there will be silence." It was a confession, a midnight whisper shared between two souls trapped in a world they hadn't chosen. A shared dream of a future that seemed impossibly distant, but also tantalizingly close. It was the most honest they'd ever been with each other, the mask slipping, revealing the raw, vulnerable humanity beneath. It was a moment of connection, of understanding, of something that felt dangerously close to hope. But even in this moment of vulnerability, the shadows lingered, the unspoken truths, the secrets that still separated them. The masks were down, but the walls were still there, and the question remained, could they ever truly be torn down? Or would they forever be prisoners of their past, their roles, their destinies? The night held its breath, waiting for an answer that neither of them knew. Chapter 8. A Dance with the Devil. Dario's trust in Alessandra grew, and with it, her involvement in the more delicate aspects of his operations. He began to include her in meetings with his cape regimes, the lieutenants who controlled the various factions of his organization. These meetings were held in the study, late at night, the air thick with cigar smoke and the unspoken tension of men who lived by a code of violence and loyalty. Alessandra was initially intimidated by these men, hardened criminals with scarred faces and cold eyes. But she quickly learned to hold her own, her intelligence and sharp wit earning their grudging respect. She observed their interactions, analyzed their power dynamics, and offered her insights to Dario, often pointing out subtle nuances he had missed. She was walking a tightrope, navigating the treacherous waters of Mafia politics, her every move scrutinized, her every word weighed. She knew that one wrong step could have dire consequences, not just for her, but for Dario as well. One evening, Dario informed her that he was hosting a gathering, a social event for the heads of the other major families in the city. It was a delicate dance of power and diplomacy, a chance to maintain alliances, assess rivals, and demonstrate strength. "This is important, Alessandra," he said, his voice serious. "It's a chance to show them who we are, to solidify our position." He wanted her to be there, by his side, not just as a decorative accessory, but as a partner. He wanted her to use her charm, her intelligence, her understanding of human nature, to help him navigate the complex web of relationships.
"I want you to observe," he said.
"Listen. Analyze.
"Tell me what you see."
Tell me what you feel." She dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a long, flowing black dress that was both elegant and understated. She wore her hair up, accentuating her long neck and delicate features. She looked regal, sophisticated, a woman of power and grace. The villa was transformed for the event. The grand ballroom, usually empty and silent, was filled with music, laughter, and the murmur of conversations. The guests were a mix of elegantly dressed men and women, their faces a mask of polite smiles and veiled intentions. The air was thick with a scent of expensive perfume, cigar smoke, and the unspoken tension of a gathering of predators. Dario introduced Alessandra to the other family heads, his hand resting possessively on her back, a clear signal that she was under his protection. She greeted them with a polite smile, her eyes assessing, her mind analyzing. She listened to their conversations, observed their body language, noted their alliances and rivalries. She quickly realized that this was more than just a social gathering. It was a performance, a carefully choreographed dance of power and deception. Each word, each gesture, each glance had a hidden meaning, a subtle implication. She noticed the way Don Angelo Rossi, the head of the oldest and most powerful family, looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and something else. Something that made her skin crawl. She noticed the way Don Marco Bellini, a young, ambitious capo, seemed to be constantly watching Dario, his eyes filled with a mixture of envy and resentment. She noticed the way Donata Sofia Grimaldi, the only female head of a family, treated Dario with a mixture of respect and flirtation. She reported her observations to Dario, her voice low, her words discreet. He listened intently, his eyes narrowed, his mind processing the information. "Rossi is interested in you," he said, his voice tight, a hint of jealousy in his tone. "Be careful around him. He's dangerous." "Bellini is ambitious," she said. "He wants your position. He's waiting for you to make a mistake." "Grimaldi is playing a game," she said. "She's trying to seduce you, to gain your favor." Dario nodded, his expression grim. "You see things clearly, Alessandra. You have a gift." It was dangerous. He was jealous, which means he cared, at least in some capacity. As the evening progressed, Alessandra found herself drawn into the dance, her movements fluid and graceful, her words carefully chosen, her smile masking her true feelings. She was playing a role, pretending to be someone she wasn't, navigating the treacherous currents of this dangerous world. She was truly dancing with the devil.
It was a game.
A deadly one. And she was playing to win. Not for power, not for wealth, but for survival. And perhaps for something more. Something she couldn't quite name. Something that flickered in the darkness. A fragile flame of hope. A hope born of shared secrets, of midnight confessions, of a connection forged in the crucible of a world where trust was a luxury and betrayal was a constant threat. The dance continued, the music swirling around them, the masks firmly in place, but beneath the surface, the tectonic plates of their relationship were shifting, the ground beneath their feet unsteady, the future uncertain. She danced closer, testing the boundaries of this dangerous game, not knowing where it would lead, but knowing that she could no longer simply stand on the sidelines. Chapter 9. The Price of Defiance. The aftermath of the gathering brought a shift in the dynamics of the Benedetti household. Dario, spurred by Alessandra's insights and perhaps a touch of jealousy, became more protective, more possessive. He kept her closer, involving her even more deeply in his affairs, trusting her judgment implicitly. However, this increased closeness also brought increased scrutiny from others. The whispers within the palazzo grew louder, the eyes of servants and soldati alike following Alessandra with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Some saw her as an outsider, a threat to the established order. Others saw her as an opportunity, a way to gain favor with Dario. One evening, Marco, Dario's consigliere, the man who had delivered her to the Benedettis, approached her in the library. He was a man of few words, his face a mask of stoic loyalty, but Alessandra had always sensed a subtle undercurrent of something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. "Signorina Romano," he said, his voice low, his eyes guarded. "May I have a word?" She closed her book, her heart beating slightly faster. "Of course, Marco." He hesitated, glancing around the room, as if to ensure they were alone. "Don Dario, he values your counsel," he said. "He trusts you." She nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "But you must be careful," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This world, it is not kind to outsiders. To women, especially women who gain influence." She understood his warning. She was walking a tightrope, and there were many who would be happy to see her fall. "I understand," she said, her voice firm. "I am grateful for your concern." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, a flicker of something akin to pity in their depths. "Be careful, Signorina. Not everyone wishes you well." His warning echoed in her mind in the days that followed. She became more cautious, more discreet, aware that she was being watched, judged, her every move scrutinized. The tension came to a head during a meeting with one of Dario's lieutenants, a man named Enzo, who controlled the lucrative docks district. Enzo was a brutal, ambitious man, known for his ruthlessness and his disdain for women. He had been openly hostile to Alessandra from the beginning, resenting her presence, her influence over Dario. During the meeting, Enzo challenged Dario's decision on a particular matter, a dispute with a rival gang over territory. Alessandra, seeing a flaw in Enzo's reasoning, spoke up, offering an alternative solution, a way to resolve the conflict without resorting to violence. Enzo turned on her, his eyes filled with rage. "You know nothing, Putana," he snarled. "This is men's business.
Keep your mouth shut."
The room fell silent. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how Dario would react. Alessandra felt a surge of fear, but also defiance. She had earned her place here, she had proven her worth, and she wouldn't be silenced by this brute. Dario's face was a mask of cold fury. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Enzo. "You will apologize to Signorina Romano," he said, his voice dangerously low, the air crackling with tension.
"Now."
Enzo hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, realizing that he had crossed a line. He had challenged not just Alessandra, but Dario's authority. I apologize, Don Dario," he mumbled, his face flushed with shame. "I spoke out of turn." Dario nodded, his gaze still fixed on Enzo.
"You will remember this," he said.
"Signorina Romano speaks with my voice. You disrespect her. You disrespect me." He then turned to Alessandra, his expression softening slightly. Are you all right? She nodded, her heart still pounding, but her spirit unbroken. I am fine, Dario. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Enzo was subdued, his arrogance shattered. The others were careful to show Alessandra respect, realizing that she was under Dario's protection, that she was untouchable. It has shown that Dario had a sense of protection and some value, but still used a harsh word, which was reflective of the time. The incident was a turning point. It demonstrated Dario's unwavering loyalty to Alessandra, his willingness to defend her, even against his own men. It also solidified her position within the organization, making her a force to be reckoned with. But it also came at a price. The price of defiance. The price of challenging the established order. The price of being a woman in a man's world. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. And she knew that there would be other challenges, other enemies, other prices to pay. The silence in the room after Enzo's outburst was more telling than any words could have been. A heavy blanket of unspoken resentments and simmering tensions. She had made an enemy, and in this world, enemies had a way of making their presence felt. The price of her defiance would be steep, she knew, but she was prepared to pay it. Or so she thought. Chapter 10. Scars Beneath the Surface. The Enzo incident, while solidifying Alessandra's position within the Benedetti organization, also exposed a deeper vulnerability. It wasn't just the external threats, the resentments of men like Enzo, that she had to contend with. It was also the internal scars, the emotional baggage that both she and Dario carried, the unspoken traumas that shaped their actions and colored their perceptions. Dario, in particular, became more withdrawn after the incident, his usual guarded demeanor becoming even more pronounced. He spent long hours in his study, poring over documents, his face a mask of concentration, his eyes dark and troubled. He seemed to be wrestling with his own demons, battling the ghosts of his past. Alessandra tried to reach him, to break through the walls he had erected around himself, but he remained distant, elusive. He was polite, courteous, even tender at times, but there was a part of him that he kept locked away, a part that she couldn't access. One evening, she found him on the terrace, staring out at the night sky, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked lost, vulnerable, a stark contrast to the powerful, controlling figure he usually projected.
Dario?
She said softly, approaching him cautiously. He turned, his eyes startled, as if he hadn't heard her approach. He forced a smile, a weak, fleeting gesture that didn't quite reach his eyes. Alessandra, he said, his voice a low rumble. I didn't hear you. She stood beside him, looking out at the same view, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Are you all right? She asked. He shrugged, his shoulders tense. I'm fine, he said, his voice unconvincing. She knew he was lying. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weariness in his posture, the unspoken turmoil that raged within him. You can talk to me, Dario, she said, her voice gentle, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, a gesture of comfort, of connection. He flinched slightly at her touch, as if he wasn't used to human contact, to tenderness. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, a mixture of longing and fear in their depths. It's not easy, he said, his voice barely a whisper. To talk about. The things I've seen. The things I've done. She nodded, understanding. She knew he carried a heavy burden, the weight of his family's legacy, the violence that had shaped his life. I know, she said, but sometimes it helps. To share the burden. To let someone in. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his mind seemingly far away. There are things, he said, his voice strained, that you wouldn't understand. Things that would disgust you. He finished his drink in a swift motion. She looked at him, her eyes filled with compassion. Try me, she said. I'm stronger than you think. He turned to her, his eyes locking with hers, a spark of something akin to hope flickering in their depths. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for a difficult task. My father, he said, his voice low, his words coming slowly, haltingly.
He was a hard man.
A cruel man. He demanded absolute obedience, absolute loyalty. He punished any sign of weakness, any hint of dissent. He paused, his gaze drifting back to the horizon, his expression clouding over. He hurt my mother, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He broke her spirit. He made her afraid. Alessandra felt a surge of anger, of outrage, on behalf of the woman she had never met, the woman who had given birth to this complicated, troubled man. "And you?" she asked softly. "Did he hurt you?" He nodded, his eyes filled with a pain that was both ancient and raw. "He tried to make me like him," he said. "He forced me to witness things, to participate in things that no child should ever see, no child should ever do." He closed his eyes as if he could not bear to meet her gaze with these words. He opened his eyes, tears welling up, threatening to spill over. He quickly blinked them away, forcing a mask of composure back onto his face. "I hated him," he said, his voice filled with a venom that surprised her. "I wanted to kill him." He spoke of his conflicted feelings about avenging his father's murder. Alessandra reached out, her hand covering his. His touch was cold, his grip trembling. She held his hand tightly, offering him a silent gesture of support, of understanding.
"But you didn't," she said.
He shook his head.
"No. Someone else did it for me."
Saved him the trouble. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, guilt, and something else. Something that looked like shame. "I became him," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I became the man I hated." It was a confession, a raw, honest admission of his deepest fears, his darkest secrets. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed around himself. And in that moment, Alessandra saw him, not as a capo, not as a predator, but as a man. A wounded, broken man, struggling to reconcile his past with his present, his demons with his desires. A man who, despite everything, still yearned for something more, something better, something she, perhaps, could offer. The scars beneath the surface were laid bare, the wounds exposed, and in that shared vulnerability, a new connection was forged, a deeper understanding, a fragile bond that transcended their roles, their pasts, their fears. The night held its breath, the silence filled with unspoken emotions, the future still uncertain, but now, perhaps, a little less daunting. Chapter 11. Broken Vows and New Promises. Dario's confession had shattered the remaining barriers between them, creating a space for intimacy that transcended the physical. They began to share more of themselves, their fears, their hopes, their dreams, the fragments of their past that had shaped them into the people they were. Alessandra, in turn, shared her own story, the pain of losing her mother at a young age, the suffocating expectations of her father, the gilded cage of her upbringing. She spoke of her longing for a different life, a life of purpose, of meaning, of love. Dario listened intently, his eyes filled with a compassion she had never seen before. He understood her pain, her yearning, her desire for something more. He saw her, not as a pawn, not as a possession, but as a woman he respected, a woman he admired, a woman he perhaps loved. Their relationship shifted, evolving from a forced arrangement into something deeper, something more meaningful. They spent hours talking, sharing their thoughts, their feelings, their fears. They found solace in each other's company, a comfort in their shared vulnerability. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace in his study, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, Dario took her hand, his touch gentle, his gaze intense. "Alessandra," he said, his voice low, his words filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I care about you. Deeply." She looked at him, her eyes searching his, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had known, of course, that his feelings for her had changed, that he was no longer just using her, that he saw her as more than just a prize. But hearing the words, spoken aloud, was different. It was real. "I care about you too, Dario," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled, A genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his features, making him appear almost boyish. "I know this is not the life you wanted," he said, "but I want to make it better.
For you. For us."
He paused, his gaze searching hers, his eyes filled with a question, a hope, a plea.
"I want to offer you something more," he said.
Something real.
Something permanent.
He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, velvet box. He opened it, revealing a ring, a stunning diamond, set in a delicate platinum band. It was not the Benedetti crest, but a single, beautiful stone. A new ring for a new life. Alessandra gasped, her eyes widening in surprise. She had not expected this.
Not now.
Not ever. "Alessandra Romano," he said, his voice a low rumble, filled with emotion. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife?" Not a name only, as it started, but as a partner? It was not a command, not a demand, but a proposal. A genuine, heartfelt offer of love. A love born of shared pain, of mutual respect, of a connection that had defied all odds. She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears, her heart overflowing with a mixture of emotions: joy, fear, surprise, and something else. Something that felt like love. True love. She had come to this place as a captive, a pawn in a dangerous game, a victim of circumstance. She had expected to find only darkness, only violence, only despair. But she had found something else. Something unexpected. Something beautiful. Something real. She had found a connection. A shared humanity. A love. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Dario. I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling slightly. It fit perfectly, a symbol of their union, their commitment, their future. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tender kiss that sealed their promise. It was not a passionate kiss, not yet, but a gentle, loving gesture, a promise of things to come. A new kind of vow, built on free will. The broken vows of their past, the forced arrangements, the betrayals, the debts, all seemed to fade away, replaced by a new promise, a new hope, a new beginning. They were still in the midst of a dangerous world, surrounded by enemies, facing an uncertain future. But they were no longer alone. They had each other. And that, perhaps, was enough.
For now.
The fireplace crackled, the flames reflecting in the diamond on her finger, a beacon of hope in the darkness, a symbol of a love that had defied all odds. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Alessandra felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, a sense of home. The promise was made, not in the shadows of obligation, but in the light of a shared, fragile, but growing love. Chapter 12. The Lioness in Winter. The news of Dario and Alessandra's impending marriage sent ripples through the intricate web of Mafia families. Some saw it as a strategic alliance, a strengthening of the Benedetti power. Others saw it as a weakness, a sign that Dario had been seduced by a woman, that he had lost his edge. Don Angelo Rossi, the head of the Rossi family, was particularly displeased. He had hoped to use Alessandra as a pawn in his own game, a way to gain leverage over Dario. He saw her as a prize to be won, a trophy to be displayed. He sent Dario a message, veiled as a congratulatory note, but containing a thinly veiled threat. "I wish you happiness, Don Dario," the message read. "But remember, marriage is a sacred bond, not to be trifled with, not to be broken." Dario knew what Rossi was implying. He was warning him, reminding him that any perceived weakness, any betrayal, would be met with swift and brutal retribution. Dario, however, was not intimidated. He had made his choice, and he would stand by it. He loved Alessandra, and he would protect her, no matter the cost. He showed Alessandra the message, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and determination. "He's threatening us," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Dario nodded. "He's testing us. He wants to see if I'm weak, if I'm willing to sacrifice you for peace. He took her hand, his grip firm, his gaze intense. I won't let him, he said, his voice low, his words filled with a fierce protectiveness. I won't let him touch you. I won't let him hurt you. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. She knew he meant it. She had seen his ruthlessness, his capacity for violence, but she had also seen his love. And she knew that he would do anything to protect her. I'm not afraid, Dario, she said, her voice firm, her spirit unbroken. I'm with you. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I know, he said, and that's what makes you so dangerous.
To them.
They decided to move the wedding up, to make it a smaller, more private affair, to limit the risk of any interference. They chose a small chapel on the estate, a beautiful, intimate space surrounded by gardens. Alessandra, with Sophia's help, planned the wedding, choosing the flowers, the music, the menu, creating a celebration that reflected their love, their connection, their hope for the future. She chose a simple, elegant white dress, a symbol of purity, of new beginnings. She wore her hair down, adorned with a single white flower, a tribute to her mother. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, the sun shining, the birds singing, a stark contrast to the darkness that surrounded them. The chapel was filled with a small gathering of close friends and family, those who truly supported their union, those who wished them well. Marco, Dario's consigliere, stood beside him, his face a mask of stoic loyalty, but his eyes betraying a flicker of something else. Something that looked like approval. Alessandra walked down the aisle, her arm linked with Sophia's, her heart pounding against her ribs, her eyes fixed on Dario. He looked handsome, regal, his dark eyes filled with a love that made her breath catch in her throat. The ceremony was simple, but moving, the words spoken with a sincerity that resonated throughout the chapel. They exchanged vows, their voices clear and strong, their promises echoing in the silence. I, Dario Benedetti, take you, Alessandra Romano, to be my wife, Dario said, his voice filled with emotion. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. I, Alessandra Romano, take you, Dario Benedetti, to be my husband, Alessandra said, her voice trembling slightly, but filled with a love that transcended all fear. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. They exchanged rings, the symbols of their commitment, their bond, their future. The priest pronounced them husband and wife, and Dario leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tender kiss that sealed their union. It was a moment of pure joy, a moment of triumph over adversity, a moment of love. A love that had blossomed in the darkness, a love that had defied all odds, a love that had transformed them both. The lioness had found her place, not in a cage, but beside her lion, ready to face the winter, together. The cheers were muted, respectful, but filled with a genuine warmth that belied the dangerous world outside the chapel walls. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, but the shadows still lingered, the threats still loomed, and the future remained uncertain. But for now, in this moment, they were happy. They were together. And they were in love. Chapter 13. Blood on the cobblestones. The fragile peace that followed the wedding was shattered a few weeks later. Dario and Alessandra were returning from a quiet dinner in San Giorgio, the village that held such significance for them both. They were in the limousine, driving through the narrow, winding streets, when a sudden burst of gunfire erupted, shattering the windows, ripping through the metal, sending shards of glass flying. Dario reacted instantly, pulling Alessandra down, shielding her with his body, his instincts honed by years of living in a world where violence was a constant threat. The car swerved, careening out of control, crashing into a stone wall. Alessandra felt a sharp pain in her arm, a burning sensation that made her cry out. She looked down, seeing blood soaking through her dress, the crimson stains spreading rapidly. Dario, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of fury and fear, pulled her from the wreckage, his movements quick and efficient. He ripped a piece of his shirt, wrapping it around her arm, applying pressure to the wound. "Stay with me, Alessandra," he said, his voice urgent, his breath ragged. "Stay with me." He scanned the surroundings, his eyes searching for the attackers, his body tense, ready to defend them both. The street was deserted, the only sounds the crackling of flames from the burning car and the distant wail of sirens. He knew who was responsible.
Rossi.
It was a message, a declaration of war, a brutal reminder that their happiness was fragile, that their love was a threat. He helped Alessandra to her feet, supporting her weight, his arm around her waist. "We need to get out of here," he said. "We need to disappear." They moved quickly, silently, through the dark, narrow alleyways, Dario leading the way, his senses heightened, his every muscle taut, ready for any sign of danger. He knew the village well, every hidden passage, every secret escape route. They reached a small, unassuming house, a safe house that Dario had maintained for years, a place where he could disappear, a place where he could hide. He unlocked the door, pushing Alessandra inside, his movements swift and decisive. The house was sparsely furnished, but clean and secure, a haven from the storm that raged outside. He tended to her wound, his touch surprisingly gentle, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He cleaned the wound, applying a makeshift bandage, his face etched with concern. "It's not too bad," he said, his voice trying to reassure her, but his eyes betraying his fear. "It's a graze. But we need to get you to a doctor." She nodded, her head throbbing, her body aching, her mind racing. She was scared, terrified, but she also felt a surge of adrenaline, a fierce determination to survive. "They won't stop," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They'll keep coming." Dario nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said, "but I won't let them hurt you. I promised you." He got her settled and started to plan their next move. He made a phone call, his voice low, his words cryptic, speaking in a code that Alessandra didn't understand. He was calling in his allies, his loyal soldiers, those who would protect them, those who would fight for them. He hung up the phone, his face a mask of determination.
"We'll be safe here for now," he said.
"But we need to plan. We need to fight back." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and resolve. "This changes everything, Alessandra," he said. "This is war. And we're in it together." The blood on the cobblestones was a stark reminder of the world they lived in, a world of violence, of betrayal, of constant threat. But it was also a testament to their love, their resilience, their determination to survive. Together. The quiet night was filled with a new kind of tension, not of unspoken desires, but of a fight for survival. They were no longer just lovers, they were soldiers, bound together by a shared enemy, a shared danger, and a shared determination to win. The sanctuary of the safe house was a temporary reprieve, but the war had begun, and they knew that the coming days would be filled with uncertainty, with danger, and with the constant threat of loss. Chapter 14. Letters from a Ghost. The days that followed were a blur of clandestine meetings, hushed phone calls, and the constant, gnawing fear of discovery. Dario moved Alessandra from one safe house to another, staying one step ahead of Rossi's men, his network of contacts and allies providing them with a fragile shield of protection. Alessandra's arm healed, but the emotional wounds were deeper, the constant fear and uncertainty taking its toll. She saw a change in Dario, a hardening of his resolve, a return to the ruthless, calculating capo he had tried to leave behind. He was consumed by the need for revenge, for retribution, his love for her intertwined with a burning desire to crush his enemies. One evening, while they were hiding in a small apartment in a nondescript building in the outskirts of the city, Dario received a package. It was a plain, brown envelope, with no return address, only his name written in a familiar, elegant script. He opened it cautiously, his eyes narrowed, his senses on high alert. Inside, he found a stack of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were old, yellowed with age. The ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was his mother's. He stared at the letters, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't seen her handwriting in years, hadn't allowed himself to think about her, to remember the pain, the loss, the betrayal. Alessandra, sensing his distress, approached him cautiously.
Dario? What is it?
He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and something else. Something that looked like grief. "It's my mother," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "These are her letters." He handed her the letters, his hand shaking. She took them, her heart pounding against her ribs, her mind racing.
Who had sent them? And why?
She sat beside him, and together, they began to read. The letters were addressed to a man named Giovanni, a name Alessandra didn't recognize. They were love letters, filled with passion, with longing, with a desperate plea for escape. "My dearest Giovanni," one letter read, "I dream of a life with you, a life away from all this darkness, a life where we can be free, a life where we can love each other without fear." Another letter read, "I'm afraid, Giovanni.
He suspects.
He watches me. He controls me. I don't know how much longer I can endure this." And another, "I have a son, Giovanni, a beautiful boy. He reminds me of you. He gives me hope. He gives me strength." As they read through the letters, a chilling realization dawned upon them. Dario's mother had been having an affair. She had been planning to leave his father, to run away with her lover. And Giovanni was not just her lover. He was Dario's biological father. Dario sat there, stunned, his world shattered, his identity questioned. He had always believed he was a Benedetti, a descendant of a long line of powerful, ruthless men. But now he discovered that he was someone else. Someone different. "I don't understand," he said, his voice a choked whisper.
Who am I?
Alessandra took his hand, her grip firm, her eyes filled with compassion.
You are Dario, she said.
"The man I love. The man I married. Your blood doesn't define you. Your choices do." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his face etched with pain, confusion, and a flicker of hope. "But my father," he said. "The man I thought was my father. He knew. He must have known." Alessandra nodded. "And he hated you for it," she said. "He punished you for something that wasn't your fault." The letters also revealed something else. Something even more shocking. It was Dario's mother who had orchestrated Antonio Benedetti's death. She had arranged for him to be killed, hoping to escape with her lover and her son. But her plan had failed. Giovanni had been killed, and she had been trapped, forced to remain with the man she hated, her spirit broken, her dream shattered. Dario felt a surge of anger, of outrage, on behalf of his mother, the woman he had barely known, the woman who had suffered so much, the woman who had loved him. "She tried to protect me," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of grief and admiration. "She sacrificed everything for me." He realized his mother had also asked a young Marco to look after Dario, should anything ever happen to her. He looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a new determination. "This changes everything," he said. "This explains everything." The letters from a ghost had not only revealed a hidden truth about his past, but they had also given him a new purpose, a new reason to fight. He would avenge his mother's death, he would clear her name, and he would destroy those who had wronged her. And he would do it with Alessandra by his side. The past had risen, not to haunt them, but to fuel them, to strengthen their resolve, to bind them even closer together. The letters were a testament to a love that had been lost, but also a reminder that love, in its purest form, could endure, even death, and that it could inspire, even from beyond the grave, a new fight, a new purpose, a new destiny. Chapter 15. The Taste of Forbidden Fruit. The revelation of Dario's true parentage and his mother's tragic fate ignited a fire in him, a burning desire for justice, for retribution. But it also ignited something else, something deeper, something more intimate. It ignited a passion for Alessandra, a fierce, possessive love that transcended the boundaries of their carefully constructed world. He had always been attracted to her, drawn to her strength, her intelligence, her spirit. But now, knowing that he was not bound by the Benedetti blood, that he was free to choose his own destiny, he felt a liberation, a release from the shackles of his past. He began to express his love for her more openly, more passionately, his touch more possessive, his gaze more intense, his words more explicit. He showered her with affection, with gifts, with attention. He treated her, not as a wife, not as a partner, but as a lover. One evening, after another clandestine meeting with his allies, he returned to their hideout, his body tense, his mind racing, his senses on high alert. He found Alessandra in the small living room, reading a book by the dim light of a single lamp. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly at the intensity of his gaze.
Dario?
"What is it?" He didn't answer. He simply walked towards her, his movements fluid and graceful, his eyes locked on hers, his expression a mixture of desire and something else. Something that looked like hunger. He reached her, his hands reaching out, cupping her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tender kiss that quickly deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate. She responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his, her own desire mirroring his. She had always been attracted to him, drawn to his power, his charisma, his danger. But now, knowing that he loved her, that he chose her, that he was free to be with her, she felt a liberation, a surrender to the feelings she had long suppressed. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her to the bedroom, his lips never leaving hers. He laid her gently on the bed, his body covering hers, his weight a welcome pressure, a promise of pleasure. He kissed her again, his lips trailing down her neck, his teeth gently grazing her skin, his hands exploring her body, his touch sending shivers down her spine. She moaned softly, her body arching towards his, her hands fumbling with his clothes, desperate to feel his skin against hers. He shed his clothes quickly, impatiently, his eyes never leaving hers, his gaze filled with a raw, primal desire that both thrilled and frightened her. He was a beautiful man, his body sculpted, his muscles taut, his skin smooth and warm. He was a predator, a warrior, a lover. And he was hers. They came together, their bodies merging, their souls entwining, their hearts beating as one. It was not just a physical act, but a spiritual union, a merging of two souls who had found each other in the darkness, who had defied all odds, who had chosen to love. It was a passionate, intense, almost violent encounter, a release of pent-up emotions, of unspoken desires, of forbidden fruit. It was a taste of freedom, a taste of love, a taste of something that transcended the boundaries of their world, of their past, of their fears. Afterward, they lay entangled, their bodies glistening with sweat, their breaths ragged, their hearts still pounding. Dario held her close, his arms wrapped around her, his face buried in her hair, his voice a low murmur against her ear. "I love you, Alessandra," he said, his words filled with a sincerity that made her heart ache. "I love you more than anything, more than life itself." She kissed him, her lips soft and tender, her eyes filled with a love that mirrored his. "I love you too, Dario," she said. "More than words can say." The forbidden fruit had been tasted, the boundaries had been crossed, the lines had been blurred. They were no longer just captor and captive, no longer just allies in a dangerous game. They were lovers, bound together by a passion that had ignited in the darkness, a love that had defied all odds, a destiny that they had chosen for themselves. The night was filled with a new kind of silence, not of fear, not of uncertainty, but of contentment. A silence born of shared passion, of mutual love, of a promise that went beyond words, beyond vows, beyond the confines of their world. They had found each other, and in that finding, they had found themselves. The taste of forbidden fruit lingered, sweet and intoxicating, a reminder of the passion that bound them together, a passion that would fuel their fight, their love, their future. Chapter 16. Trials by Fire. The consummation of their love marked a turning point, but it also raised the stakes. Dario, fueled by his passion for Alessandra and his newfound understanding of his past, became even more determined to strike back at Rossi and reclaim his rightful place. He knew that Rossi wouldn't rest until he had destroyed them both, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect the woman he loved and secure their future. He began to orchestrate a series of moves, calculated risks designed to weaken Rossi's power base and expose his vulnerabilities. He used Alessandra's insights, her understanding of human nature, her ability to see the hidden connections, to guide his strategy. She was his confidant, his advisor, his partner, in every sense of the word. One of their first targets was Marco Bellini, the ambitious young capo who had been eyeing Dario's position. Alessandra had identified him as a potential threat, a weak link in Rossi's chain of command. Dario, using his network of contacts and his own cunning, managed to gather evidence of Bellini's disloyalty, his secret dealings with rival families, his plans to overthrow Rossi and seize control for himself. He presented this evidence to Rossi, not out of any loyalty to the man, but as a way to sow discord, to create chaos within Rossi's organization, to weaken him from within. Rossi, enraged by Bellini's betrayal, had him executed, a brutal act that sent a clear message to anyone who dared to challenge his authority. But the execution also created a power vacuum, an opportunity for Dario to step in and consolidate his own position. He began to win over some of Bellini's former allies, promising them protection, offering them a share of the spoils, building his own power base within the fractured landscape of the city's underworld. Alessandra, meanwhile, was working on another front. She had discovered, through her own network of informants, that Rossi was involved in a massive money laundering scheme, using a series of shell corporations and offshore accounts to hide his ill-gotten gains. She gathered evidence, meticulously documenting the transactions, tracing the flow of money, exposing the intricate web of deceit. It was dangerous work, risky and potentially deadly, but she was driven by a fierce determination to bring Rossi down, to avenge Dario's mother, to secure their future. She presented her findings to Dario, her hands trembling slightly, her heart pounding against her ribs. He looked at the documents, his eyes narrowed, his face a mask of cold fury. "This is it," he said, his voice low, his words filled with a grim satisfaction. "This is how we destroy him." He knew that exposing Rossi's financial crimes would not only cripple his organization, but it would also attract the attention of the authorities, the police, the tax investigators, the law. It was a risky move, a gamble that could backfire, but it was also their best chance to bring Rossi down, to end his reign of terror. They decided to leak the information anonymously to a trusted journalist, a woman known for her integrity and her relentless pursuit of truth. They knew that once the story broke, it would be like lighting a fuse, setting off a chain reaction that would engulf Rossi and his entire empire. The article was published, splashed across the front page of the city's leading newspaper, the headline screaming, "Mafia boss implicated in massive money laundering scheme." The fallout was immediate and devastating. Rossi's assets were frozen, his businesses were raided, his allies were arrested, his empire began to crumble. He was besieged, hunted, his power broken. But Rossi was not a man to go down without a fight. He knew who was responsible for his downfall, and he was determined to retaliate. He sent his men after Dario and Alessandra, launching a series of attacks, desperate attempts to silence them, to eliminate the threat they posed. They were forced to go deeper underground, moving from one safe house to another, their lives constantly in danger, their love their only solace. They were facing trials by fire, tests of their courage, their resilience, their commitment to each other. But they were not alone. They had each other, and they had a purpose: to destroy Rossi, to avenge the past, to build a future. Together, the flames of conflict raged around them, but their love burned brighter, stronger, a beacon of hope in the darkness, a testament to the power of choice, of defiance, of a love that had defied all odds. Chapter 17. a requiem for the past. Rossi, cornered and desperate, lashed out with a final, brutal act of vengeance. He ordered a hit on the small chapel where Dario and Alessandra had been married, the place that held such symbolic significance for them, the place where they had made their vows, their promises, their commitment to each other. Dario and Alessandra were not there at the time, having been warned by one of their informants, a low-level soldier within Rossi's organization who had grown disillusioned with his boss's ruthlessness. But the attack was a message, a clear indication that Rossi was willing to do anything, to destroy anything, to get to them. When Dario and Alessandra saw the news, the images of the burning chapel, the shattered stained glass windows, the charred remains of the altar, they were devastated. It was more than just an attack on a building, it was an attack on their love, their hope, their future. Alessandra wept, her body shaking with grief, her heart aching for the loss of the sacred space, the symbol of their union. Dario held her close, his arms wrapped around her, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with a desire for revenge. "He won't get away with this," he said, his voice low, his words filled with a deadly promise. "He will pay. For everything." He knew that he could no longer afford to play defense, to react to Rossi's moves. He had to take the offensive, to strike at the heart of Rossi's power, to end his reign of terror once and for all. He gathered his most trusted allies, his capo regimes, his loyal soldiers, those who had remained true to him, those who believed in his vision, those who were willing to fight for him. He laid out his plan, a daring, audacious assault on Rossi's heavily guarded compound, a fortress located on the outskirts of the city. It was a risky move, a gamble that could cost them everything, but it was also their only chance to end this war, to secure their freedom. Alessandra, despite her fear, stood by his side, her presence a source of strength, her intelligence a valuable asset, her love his inspiration. She had come to terms with the violence of this world, with the necessity of fighting for what they believed in, for the future they wanted to build. "I'm with you, Dario," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "Always." The attack was launched at dawn, a coordinated assault that caught Rossi's men by surprise. Dario led the charge, his movements swift and decisive, his gun blazing, his eyes focused on his target. He was a warrior, a leader, a man driven by a righteous fury. The fighting was intense, brutal, a chaotic dance of death and destruction. Bullets flew, bodies fell, blood stained the ground. The air was filled with the sounds of gunfire, the screams of the dying, the stench of death. Alessandra, armed with a small pistol that Dario had given her, stayed close to him, her presence a constant reminder of what he was fighting for, of what he was protecting. She was not a soldier, but she was a survivor. And she would fight for her life, for her love, for her future. They fought their way through the compound, room by room, floor by floor, encountering fierce resistance, but their determination, their skill, their love for each other, gave them the strength to prevail. Finally, they reached Rossi's inner sanctum, a lavishly decorated office, where the old man was waiting for them, his face a mask of defiance, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and fear. "You won't win, Benedetti," Rossi snarled, his voice raspy, his hand clutching a pistol. "You can't kill me.
I am invincible."
Dario looked at him, his expression cold, his eyes filled with a deadly calm.
"You're wrong, Rossi," he said.
"You're finished. Your reign of terror is over." Rossi raised his pistol, aiming at Dario, his hand trembling slightly. But before he could pull the trigger, Alessandra stepped forward, her own pistol raised, her aim steady, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. She fired, the shot echoing through the room, the bullet finding its mark, striking Rossi in the chest. He staggered backward, his eyes widening in surprise, his body slumping to the floor, his life extinguished. It was over. The war was won. Rossi was dead. Dario looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and love. She had saved his life. She had avenged his mother. She had secured their future. They stood there, in the silence of the aftermath, the smoke still lingering in the air, the bodies of their enemies scattered around them. It was a requiem for the past, a farewell to the violence, the betrayal, the darkness that had haunted their lives. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, a chance to build a different future. A future built on love, on trust, on peace. The chapel may have been destroyed, but their love remained, stronger than ever, tempered by fire, forged in the crucible of conflict. They had won, but the victory was bittersweet, the cost high. They had shed blood, they had taken lives, they had become killers. But they had done it for each other. For love. For a future that was finally within their reach. Chapter 18. The Unveiling of Truths. With Rossi dead and his organization shattered, Dario and Alessandra could finally begin to rebuild their lives. The immediate threat was gone, but the scars of the past remained, the memories of violence and loss lingering like shadows in the corners of their minds. Dario, however, was determined to create a new legacy, one that was not defined by bloodshed and betrayal, but by justice, by compassion, by love. He started by dismantling the illegal operations of the Benedetti family, focusing instead on the legitimate businesses, on creating opportunities for the people in his community, on giving back. He used his wealth and influence to support local charities, to fund schools and hospitals, to improve the lives of those who had been marginalized, oppressed, exploited by the Mafia. He became a philanthropist, a benefactor, a leader who cared about his people. Alessandra, by his side, was his partner in this transformation, her intelligence, her compassion, her unwavering belief in him, guiding his decisions, shaping his vision, helping him to heal. She also pursued her own passion, establishing a foundation to support education for underprivileged children, providing them with access to books, to learning, to a better future. She became a teacher, a mentor, a role model for young girls who had grown up in a world where their opportunities were limited, their voices silenced. But there was one loose end that still needed to be tied, one truth that still needed to be revealed. The truth about Dario's biological father, Giovanni, and the circumstances surrounding his death. Dario, with Alessandra's help, began to investigate, piecing together the fragments of information from his mother's letters, from the whispers and rumors that had circulated within the family for years, from the memories that had been suppressed, hidden, buried deep within his subconscious. They discovered that Giovanni had been a local artist, a painter, a man of gentle spirit and passionate heart. He had met Dario's mother at an art exhibition, and they had fallen in love, a forbidden love that had threatened to expose the hypocrisy and corruption of the Benedetti family. Antonio Benedetti, Dario's supposed father, had discovered their affair and had ordered Giovanni's death. He had hired a hitman, a ruthless killer who had silenced Giovanni forever, leaving Dario's mother trapped in a loveless marriage, her spirit broken, her dreams shattered. But there was more. They discovered that Marco, Dario's consigliere, the man who had been like a father figure to him, the man who had always been by his side, had known the truth all along. He had been a young man at the time, a loyal soldier in Antonio Benedetti's organization, and he had been ordered to witness Giovanni's execution. He had kept the secret for years, bound by a code of silence, by a loyalty to the Benedetti family, by a guilt that had haunted him for decades. Dario confronted Marco, his heart aching, his mind reeling, his trust shattered. He demanded the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Marco, his face etched with pain, his eyes filled with regret, confessed everything. He told Dario about Giovanni, about his mother's love for him, about Antonio Benedetti's cruelty, about his own role in the tragedy. "I am sorry, Dario," Marco said, his voice trembling, his eyes filled with tears. I should have told you long ago. But I was afraid. Afraid of him. Afraid of what he would do." Dario looked at him, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and something else. Something that felt like forgiveness. He understood Marco's fear, his loyalty, his guilt. He knew that Marco had been a victim of circumstances, just like him, just like his mother. "I understand, Marco," Dario said, his voice low, his words filled with a surprising compassion. "You were young. You were scared. You did what you thought you had to do. He paused, his gaze searching Marco's, his heart aching for the man who had been both a father figure and a keeper of secrets. But it's time for the truth to be known, Dario said. It's time for justice. For my mother. For Giovanni. For us. They decided to go public with the story, to expose Antonio Benedetti's crimes, to clear Giovanni's name, to honor Dario's mother's memory. They released the letters, the evidence, the truth, to the same journalist who had exposed Rossi's money laundering scheme. The story was published, causing a sensation, shattering the myth of the Benedetti family's honor, revealing the darkness that had lurked beneath the surface for generations. It was a cathartic moment, a release of pent-up emotions, a requiem for the past. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, a chance to build a different future. A future based on truth, on justice, on love. The unveiling of truths had brought closure, not just for Dario, but for Alessandra as well, allowing them to finally step out of the shadows and into the light, free from the burdens of the past, ready to embrace a future that was finally their own. The Benedetti name, once synonymous with fear and corruption, was now associated with hope, with change, with a new legacy built on love and redemption. Chapter 19. Threads of Fate Unraveling. The public revelation of Antonio Benedetti's crimes and Dario's true parentage sent shockwaves through the city, but it also brought a sense of closure, a cleansing of the past that allowed Dario and Alessandra to move forward with their lives. They had faced their demons, confronted their enemies, and emerged stronger, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness. However, the threads of fate, once so tightly woven, began to unravel in unexpected ways. Marco, burdened by guilt and remorse for his role in Giovanni's death and the subsequent cover-up, decided to turn himself into the authorities. He confessed his involvement, providing detailed information about Antonio Benedetti's crimes and the operations of the Mafia, becoming a key witness in a sweeping investigation that targeted the remnants of Rossi's organization and other criminal elements within the city. His testimony led to numerous arrests and convictions, dismantling the last vestiges of the old power structure, paving the way for a new era of law and order. But it also meant that Marco would spend his remaining years in prison, a sacrifice he was willing to make to atone for his past sins. Dario and Alessandra visited him regularly, offering him support and forgiveness, acknowledging his courage in coming forward and his genuine remorse for his actions. They understood that he had been a product of his environment, a victim of circumstance, and they respected his decision to finally break free from the code of silence that had bound him for so long. Meanwhile, Dario continued his efforts to transform the Benedetti legacy, focusing on legitimate businesses, philanthropic endeavors, and community development. He became a respected figure in the city, admired for his resilience, his compassion, and his commitment to justice. Alessandra, by his side, flourished in her role as an educator and advocate for underprivileged children. She expanded her foundation, reaching more and more young people, providing them with opportunities they would never have had otherwise, empowering them to break free from the cycle of poverty and violence. Their lives were intertwined, their love a constant source of strength and inspiration, their shared purpose a testament to their resilience and their commitment to creating a better future. But fate, it seemed, had one more twist in store for them. One evening, while they were attending a charity gala, Alessandra experienced a sudden, sharp pain in her abdomen. She collapsed, her face pale, her body trembling. Dario rushed her to the hospital, his heart pounding with fear, his mind racing with possibilities, all of them terrifying. The doctors examined her, running tests, their faces grim, their words guarded. The diagnosis was devastating. Alessandra had a rare and aggressive form of cancer, a disease that had been silently growing within her, undetected, until it was too late. Dario was shattered, his world crumbling around him, his hope extinguished. He couldn't imagine life without Alessandra, without her love, her laughter, her light. She was his everything, his reason for being, his soulmate. He refused to accept the prognosis, seeking second opinions, consulting with specialists, exploring every possible treatment option. But the news remained the same. The cancer was too advanced, too aggressive, too relentless. Alessandra, facing her own mortality, displayed a courage and grace that astonished everyone. She accepted her fate with a quiet dignity, her spirit unbroken, her love for Dario unwavering. "I'm not afraid, Dario," she said, her voice weak, but her eyes filled with a serene acceptance. "I've lived a full life. I've found love. I've made a difference. I have no regrets." He held her hand, his tears streaming down his cheeks, his heart aching with a pain that was beyond words. "But I can't live without you, Alessandra," he said. "You're my life. My everything." She smiled, a gentle, loving smile that reached her eyes. "You will,
Dario," she said.
You're strong. You're resilient. You'll find a way. And I'll always be with you. In your heart. In your memories. In your soul." They spent their remaining days together, cherishing every moment, holding each other close, their love a shield against the encroaching darkness. They revisited San Giorgio, the village where they had first connected, the place that held such special meaning for them. They walked hand in hand through the cobblestone streets, reminiscing about their journey, their struggles, their triumphs. They returned to the Benedetti estate, to the villa that had once been a prison, but had now become a home. They sat on the terrace, watching the sunset, the sky ablaze with color, a final, beautiful spectacle. Alessandra died peacefully in Dario's arms, her last breath a sigh of contentment, her last words a whisper of love. "I love you, Dario," she said. "Always." The threads of fate had unraveled, their tapestry of love torn apart by a cruel and relentless disease. But the love remained, etched in Dario's heart, a memory that would never fade, a light that would guide him through the darkness, a legacy that would endure. He was alone again, but he was not the same man he had been when he first met Alessandra. He had been transformed by her love, by her strength, by her spirit. And he would carry her with him, always, in his heart, in his soul, in his every breath. The unraveling was painful, a tragic twist, but it also revealed the enduring power of their love, a love that had transcended all obstacles, all challenges, all tragedies. Chapter 20. Redemption in the Ruins. Dario, heartbroken and alone, was left to navigate a world that felt empty and meaningless without Alessandra. Her absence was a constant ache, a void that could never be filled. He wandered through the villa, her scent lingering in the air, her laughter echoing in his memory, her presence a ghost that haunted every room. He considered abandoning everything, retreating into the darkness, succumbing to the grief that threatened to consume him. But he knew that Alessandra wouldn't want that. She had fought so hard for life, for love, for a better future. And he owed it to her memory, to continue that fight. He decided to honor her legacy by dedicating his life to the causes she had championed, to the children she had loved, to the hope she had embodied. He poured his energy, his wealth, his heart into her foundation, expanding its reach, increasing its impact, transforming it into a powerful force for good. He became a mentor, a teacher, a father figure to countless young people, guiding them, supporting them, empowering them to overcome the obstacles in their lives, to reach their full potential. He saw Alessandra in each of their faces, in their smiles, in their dreams. He also continued his work to reform the Benedetti legacy, using his influence to promote justice, to fight corruption, to build a more equitable society. He became a voice for the voiceless, a champion of the marginalized, a force for change. He never forgot Alessandra, her memory a constant presence in his life, her love a guiding light. He visited her grave regularly, placing fresh flowers on her tombstone, speaking to her, sharing his thoughts, his feelings, his struggles. He found solace in the small chapel on the estate, the one that had been rebuilt after Rossi's attack, the one that now stood as a symbol of their resilience, their love, their triumph over adversity. He would sit there for hours, meditating, praying, remembering, finding a sense of peace, a connection to Alessandra's spirit. One day, while visiting the chapel, He noticed a young girl sitting alone in a pew, her head bowed, her body shaking with sobs. He approached her cautiously, his heart aching for her pain, his instincts telling him that she needed help. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his voice filled with compassion. The girl looked up, her eyes red and swollen, her face streaked with tears. She was about 12 years old, with long, dark hair and Alessandra's eyes. "No," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. My mother, she's sick. Very sick." Dario's heart went out to her. He knew exactly what she was going through, the fear, the helplessness, the despair. He sat beside her, putting his arm around her, offering her comfort, support, a shoulder to cry on. He listened to her story, her fears, her hopes. I don't want to lose her," she said, her voice trembling.
"She's all I have."
Dario nodded, his own eyes filling with tears.
"I know," he said.
"I understand. I lost someone very special to me, too." He told her about Alessandra, about her kindness, her compassion, her unwavering belief in the power of love. He told her about the foundation, about the work they were doing to help children just like her. The girl listened intently, her tears slowing, her eyes filled with a flicker of hope. "She sounds like an amazing woman," she said.
Dario smiled, a sad, wistful smile. "She was," he said. "She was the best.
"And she would have wanted me to help you." He offered to help the girl's mother, to pay for her medical treatment, to provide them with support, to give them hope. The girl's face lit up, her eyes shining with gratitude, her smile a ray of sunshine in the darkness. Dario realized that he had found a new purpose, a new way to honor Alessandra's memory, a new way to heal. He would continue her work, he would continue to fight for the vulnerable, he would continue to love. He had found redemption in the ruins of his past, a new beginning in the ashes of his grief, a future filled with hope. He was no longer just a capo, a warrior, a survivor. He was a healer, a protector, a father figure. He was Alessandra's legacy. And he would carry that legacy with him, always in his heart, in his soul, in his every action. The ruins of the past had become the foundation for a new future, a future built on love, on compassion, on the enduring power of the human spirit. He had found his way back from the darkness, guided by Alessandra's light, his heart forever touched by her love. The final chapter was not an ending, but a continuation, a testament to the transformative power of love and loss, a redemption found in the ruins of a shattered world. Epilogue. Years passed. Dario, his hair now streaked with silver, his face etched with the lines of time and experience, but his eyes still holding the spark of Alessandra's spirit, stood before a newly built community center. It was a vibrant, bustling place, filled with the laughter of children, the murmur of conversations, the energy of hope. The center bore a name that brought a bittersweet smile to his lips, the Alessandra Romano Community Center. He watched as children played in the playground, their faces bright with joy, their futures filled with possibilities. He saw young people studying in the library, their minds expanding, their horizons broadening, their dreams taking flight. He saw families receiving support, their burdens eased, their lives transformed. This was Alessandra's legacy, a testament to her love, her compassion, her unwavering belief in the power of hope. And it was his legacy, too, a testament to his transformation, his redemption, his enduring love for her. He walked through the center, his hand gently touching the walls, the furniture, the objects that held the essence of Alessandra's spirit. He felt her presence, her warmth, her love. She was everywhere, in every smile, in every laugh, in every act of kindness. He stopped before a large portrait of Alessandra, a beautiful painting that captured her essence, her beauty, her spirit. He gazed at her image, his eyes filled with a mixture of love, loss, and gratitude. "I miss you, amore mio," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Every day, every hour, every moment." He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the outline of her face, her smile, her eyes. He felt a warmth, a connection, a presence that transcended the physical world. He knew that she was with him, always, in his heart, in his soul, in his every breath. He knew that their love had endured, that it had transcended time, space, and even death. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that reflected the peace, the contentment, the love that he had found in the ruins of his past. He had lived a long and full life, a life filled with both darkness and light, with both pain and joy, with both loss and love. He had been a warrior, a capo, a survivor. He had been a husband, a lover, a partner. He had been a redeemer, a healer, a father figure. He had been Alessandra's love, and she had been his. He turned and walked away from the portrait, his steps slow but steady, his heart filled with a quiet joy, a serene acceptance, a profound gratitude. He had lived his life to the fullest. He had honored Alessandra's memory. He had made a difference. He walked out of the center, into the warm sunshine, the laughter of children echoing in his ears, the spirit of Alessandra surrounding him, her love his eternal guide. He knew that his time was coming, that he would soon be reunited with his beloved, that their journey would continue, together, in a place where there was no pain, no loss, no darkness. Only love. He looked up at the sky, a clear, blue expanse that stretched out to infinity, a symbol of hope, of eternity, of a love that would never end. He smiled, a peaceful, contented smile, his heart filled with love, with gratitude, with peace. He was ready. The end.